Great. Yeah, I think we can get started, and then people can kind of come in when they get here. But yeah, so this is the pre-summit with Maxime Bayen, who is the co-founder of Africa Big Deal and has just done a lot of great things for the ecosystem and really sharing some really important insights and data regarding what's happening with fundraising, what's happening with African startups. And this data is extremely important for African startups to grow and for everybody to understand what's happening in the ecosystem and really have the best strategy going forward. So thank you for all your work, firstly, in that regard. And, we're really happy to have you in the pre-summit. We wish we could have you at the real summit, but, I think this conversation will be a great kickoff to the amazing things that are happening this week. So thank you for being here. And I guess I usually allow the guests to introduce themselves and share what you want everybody to know about you and about your experiences, about your passions, interests, just whatever you want to introduce yourself with, definitely go ahead. But thank you for being here.
Cool. Thank you very much for having me. It might still be a little bit early in the week and in the day to have people joining, but let's see how it goes. So quickly on me. My full-time job is actually that I'm a senior venture builder with Catalyst Fund.
Yeah.
So that's what I do most of my time, supporting companies mainly in Africa through our acceleration program. But yes, a couple of years ago, well, a year and a half ago, I started looking at the data on startups fundraising in Africa, and that started while I was working for GSMA in a previous role, also looking at another program supporting startups in the continent. And yeah, we'll go a little bit about the genesis of this project later on, but yeah, in a nutshell, I've been working with startups in Africa for close to 7-8 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think the question I would want to start with is, what was the core motivation to actually not only look into this data, but start to put together this data in a way that's organized, in a way that people can actually use it? Because I think
so the initial motivation was basically that I couldn't find good, reliable data on that. That was back in 2019. And I was basically looking for a list of startups in Africa that had raised more than $1 million in the past year, and I couldn't really find that list. It was either not there or ridiculously expensive. And I thought, okay, it can't be that complicated to list all these deals. So I started doing it. Then I realized there were more deals than I thought, which was good news. And so I started, listing all these deals and sharing that as well with people on social media. And then I realized, well, looking at how many people like seeing this data and all the feedback I got, it seems that there's a lack of information there. So then I continued to track this data, included more and more data each time on all the deals, and started looking at deals lower stage as well. And then came a point where it was just getting quite a lot in terms of time consumption. And I was doing that as a hobby, if you want. And so I just thought, okay, I'm gonna put a small price tag on it, to continue doing it and also to improve the quality and so on, to really to make it a little bit more sustainable. In terms of time forward. So that's what I did, and the initial feedback was great. So I continued doing that. So yeah, that's a little bit the story about this start.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's extremely awesome how you saw a problem or kind of an opportunity gap and you said, let me do something about it. And I think we definitely need more people like that in the space. But Yeah, I want to take a step back. You said it couldn't have been that hard to put together the data, and that's kind of what made you start. But there must have been some sort of difficulties that you ran into trying to put together all this data, because the data set is pretty massive, and I'm sure a lot of that data wasn't the easiest to get. So what were some of those difficulties?
Well, the first difficulty is that it's to find this data. It's really patchy, right? There's bits and pieces everywhere. So um, you know, there are a couple of data like international databases like Crunchbase and so on that do capture a little bit of that. So there you have maybe 30% of the data there.
Yeah.
There are some news outlets that capture some, the Disrupt Africa and so on, that also have some bits of it. Then there are investors that are very active but not necessarily share too much information publicly. So there's a bit of information there. Then there are founders that also share information. Then there's social media, and there's plenty of stuff. And at the end of the day, the challenge is to basically talk to all the sources, look at all of them, and also cross-check the information, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we've been really focusing on, is making sure that the data is accurate, and so not just sticking to headlines, but actually looking at what's behind it, right? This company, I mean, there's a news saying this company has raised $100 million. Was that through this deal? Was that sort of the cumulative amount of money they have raised about over the past couple of years? Is that all an equity investment? Is that debt? So there's a lot of information, and you need to really go deep sometimes and unpack information there. And yeah, so that's really the challenge, that sometimes an information that most people will capture as like, these guys raised X million, is actually a little bit more tricky and complicated than that. And the challenge is really to unpack this. And then sometimes also simply finding the correct information. Who are really the co-founders? Of course, if it's a very large company and they've raised several rounds, people know. But when we're talking about a small company, early stage, and sometimes the founders are only part-time and they don't necessarily share the information that they are full-time on this company, and so on. So it's a bit more difficult. So yeah, finding who are the founders, finding when the companies was launched, finding exactly what they're doing. I mean, sometimes your company fundraising and you don't really have much information. Website is still in construction, and they are still operating in stealth mode, so you don't really know. So finding all this information is also some work, and that's what really we have been focusing on. In the database, there's a lot of details on this. So yeah, that's one of the challenges, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really interesting point. A lot of the data that we're seeing are honestly the only data that most people were seeing before this data set was just, oh, this startup raised this round, this startup raised X, Y round, whatever. And that seemed like the only data available, but obviously there's a lot of underlying data that's very useful. So I guess going into your data set, like obviously your data set has like, okay, this startup raised, 20 million, 10 million, et cetera. But what are some of the most important features of your data set, in your opinion, that you think that everybody in the ecosystem should be aware of and think about on the regular basis?
Sure, yeah. So a couple of important stuff that we have in there. First of all, is that we spend a bit of time making sure the description and the business description, what we call the tweet pitch, and the sector are as accurate as possible. So we don't just stick to what the company says they're doing, but we're actually trying to understand what they do. That's the first thing. We look at the founding team. That's another important bit. So not just the CEO, but the actual, who are all the co-founders. We look at the gender balance in the team as well, in the founding team. That I think it's an important information to track, and for things to change in that regard, and for the ecosystem to become more gender balanced. The first step is to know how not gender balanced it is today, and to not just say, out of the blue figures, but actually have data to back this up. So I think that that's really important. And so we're tracking that. Who are the founders? Are they male, female? Is it the all-female team? Is it all male team? All these things. That's really important. We also track the education background of the CEO for now, at least, trying to understand, where they graduated from, when was that, which country is that, which gives us a little bit of understanding of, who is fueling the ecosystem. And yeah, then we have details on investors. Obviously, that's another important thing. Who are the investors in the round? And there's a complete separate tab on investors. And I think today we have over 800 investors listed in this database. And for each of them, you can basically see where they're headquartered, what's the region, what's the country, website, and the number of deals they have done each year. So yeah, that's the kind of data we have. There's other stuff on whether this is the when a startup raises the first $1 million, we also indicate that's the first $1 million, how long it took for them to raise this amount of money, and so on. There's quite a bit of information. There's over 30 fields for each startup.
Right.
And yes, what's important to highlight here is that all this is done manually. It's entered manually, and it's not algorithm. It's not just bots scrapping information on websites. The reason I'm insisting on that is that there are other sources today for deals in Africa. The problem is that a lot of them are really sharing incorrect information.
Right.
Because it's automated. Because it takes time. It takes a lot of time. It takes hours. And so if you don't have these hours, then you go for shortcuts and you automate that, and that's an approach, but it's just not correct. So that's something that we try to avoid, and that's why now we are actually 3 people within the team. We recruited someone in Cameroon as well. Her name is Crescence, and she just started about a month ago. Most of this job is actually still being done manually, and I think it will remain manually for a long time until basically startups file this information in a systematic way, like it's done in Europe or in the US, for instance, and that everybody can go in the same central publicly available data. But yeah, for now there's still a bit of work there.
Just personally going through that data set, I could feel how much work it took, and it's really admirable that you guys are taking the effort to do it manually, because it's just not easy, but it's important. And having the data fundamentally be right is so important, because if not, all these insights don't really have meaning and can't really push forward any meaningful conversation. And so kind of on that point about pushing forward the meaningful conversation, right? There's the one side of creating the data set, and there's the other side of communicating the data. And then I've looked at the Big Deal Substack, and it's these very short kind of quick reads with a very clear graph. And I've seen that's kind of an intentional strategy you guys have used to communicate this data. And so just want to hear from you, what are some of the things you've thought about with communicating the great data you have, and what are some things you're thinking about in the future of that as well?
Yeah. So that started because at the beginning I was just sharing insights here and there, depending on the time I had. Sometimes sharing a couple of slides deck and stuff like that. And then my good friend Maxime was also keen to help me share some of these insights. And we thought, okay, why don't we try to systematize it? And then we thought about the format, and we're like, there's already a lot of newsletters. There's already a lot of media content. The problem with this is that, you end up receiving that by email, you flag them, and then you're like, or you put them in a folder, and you're like, read it later. And we didn't want people to do that. We wanted people to really take a look. So we thought, okay, it needs to be short. And so our approach is basically one graph, one paragraph each week. And the goal is that you can read it in less than 2 minutes, really, top to bottom, between the moment you open the email and the moment you shut it down. So that was the goal, and obviously having well designed graphic helps a lot there. So that's what Maxime really is doing, and he's been really amazing at that, I have to say. So yeah, that's a little bit the approach, and the idea is really to always leverage the database, but find different angles to put some spotlights on a topic or another. We talked about gender earlier. That was one topic. We talked about investors. We talked about different markets that seem to be attracting a lot of investment. Yeah, so that we try to be quite close to the topics that are, let's say, in views at the moment when we do it. And we also try to take a little bit of sometimes an alternative approach, looking at things in a different foot. So if we take the example of, I think 2 weeks ago, we looked at, instead of looking at funding, people sometimes compare Africa and India, for instance, and they say, oh, India has raised a lot more funding than in Africa. And yes, that's right. The population, both India and Africa, is fairly comparable. So that's a good comparative, except, and that's a big one, is that Africa is 54 markets, India is just one. Yeah. So it doesn't make actually much sense to compare those. And so we thought, okay, why don't we compare countries? So that's when we looked at the ratio of fundraising amounts over population ratio, and we compared it across a number of countries in Africa, and as well with India and other emerging markets in Asia and Latin America and so on. And then interesting things came across, like the fact that Kenya, for instance, is actually fundraised a lot more, and there's a lot more VC money that went to startups in Kenya over population than in India. And that was, I think, a little bit eye-opening to some people in the ecosystem, including ourselves. So I think that's what we try to do, is always to think of it a little bit with a different standpoint. So yeah, it's not always easy to find topics though each week. Like the weekly commitment is hard.
No, I definitely can imagine it. And on that, what are some of the more surprising insights that you like? It's one thing to be in the ecosystem, and obviously you've been around the African startup ecosystem for a while and have seen a lot of things happening. But as you put together this data set and thought about the data, what are some of the things that you're just like, wow, I did not expect that, now actually seeing the numbers and seeing the data?
Yeah, I mean, there are things that are more surprising than others. The bit that I just mentioned on like the ratio of fundraise over population was an interesting one. Yeah. Things that we tend to know, but it's good to put it with number. It's things like how massive Nigerian fintech is these days. That we're seeing big numbers. We're seeing a lot of big rounds, and sometimes those are like a little bit sort of attracting all the light, and then you think, maybe it's not the reality, but in this case, it's actually a reality. And like the fintech in Nigeria is really eating the ecosystem. Yeah. So that was not necessarily a big surprise when we put that one together. Then there are more surprising stuff. Like for instance, when it comes to the size of each fundraising stages. What's interesting to see over the past 2-3 years is that you actually have an increasing number of small tickets, small rounds. Yeah. So if you look at basically we stick to Nigeria, for instance, and if we look at the median deal size or median round size for startups in the continent over the past 3 years is actually going down. Okay. So we do see very large rounds, and there's a lot of media attraction on them and so on. But when you see one big round, there's also 10 small rounds in place. Yeah. And so that's something that was a little bit surprising, because yes, you hear less about those small rounds, the 100K and so. but it's also very good news because it means that we're really building a pyramid.
Yeah. So, yeah. Exactly.
And so yes, you have a small number of the pay stacks, the waves, the CUDA, and so on. But you have a huge number of smaller startups that are fundraising as well. So that's something that was a little bit counterintuitive initially, but when you think about it, it's a really good news. Another thing that was interesting to see, that was my third example, is that we looked at a little bit at the education backgrounds of CEOs.
Okay.
And here we see very strong differences between markets within the continent. So, there are some markets where, unsurprisingly, a lot of the CEOs and founders are educated abroad, outside Africa. And Kenya, for instance, it's quite strongly the case, with basically the vast majority of the founders that are educated abroad. But there are some cases, especially Egypt and South Africa, for instance, where the majority of founders of CEOs are actually educated locally. And what's interesting there is that, especially in these two markets, and increasingly in Nigeria as well, you realize that there's it's not just the educational background and the sort of the education space that is very much local. It's also an entire ecosystem. So
Right.
look at Egypt, you have great universities locally, and founders are graduating from these universities and successfully fundraising and so on afterwards, and scaling startups. We also have a lot of angel investors local. You have a lot of local VCs. You have a lot of local accelerators and so on. So there is really local ecosystem in the really essence word of the word ecosystem that are growing. So that was quite interesting. And it's for now it's still more exceptions rather than the rules across the continent. But that would be an interesting sort of aspects to look at in the future and see if more markets are joining the likes of Egypt and South Africa in this specific aspect. Yeah.
For sure. And yeah, I think that's a great segue into kind of this last question before I open it up for general questions. But you talked a lot about, the local ecosystem. And obviously one of the biggest reasons we're here today is because your data set was used to find that there is this gap for local founders. Maybe it's different in certain markets, but if you look at kind of the whole of Africa and all the different markets combined, there definitely is a gap for those founders educated in Africa, grew up in Africa. They're not able to raise as much money as some of those that were not. And so I'm wondering, one, did you expect the data set to be used in that way? I know we talked about it a while ago, but when did you expect the data set to be used in that way? And what is your reaction, and what do you think is a potential solution, given not only your experience in the African startup ecosystem, but also your kind of intimate knowledge of the data?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to answer, I mean, not only I expected the data to be used that way, but I actually sort of incitated people to look at it with this angle. So a couple of months ago, I think it was maybe late 2019 or early 2020, so actually a year ago, more than a year ago, I actually had posted a visual where I put the picture of the CEOs that raised more than $1 million in the past year.
Yeah.
And it was sort of basically a view of all the CEOs by video photos. And there very quickly you could see that a good chunk of them didn't look Africans, to say that like that. You could also see that a lot of them were not women. So very visually, you had a sort of an explanation of the problem. And so, yeah, then I know a lot of people use the data to look a little bit deeper into that. the reason why we haven't put metrics like nationality, for instance, in the data is that number one, it's difficult to find to be accurate on this, and we don't want to put wrong information. And number two, it's also sometimes not the problem. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily a nationality problem. And so, that might have only depicted part of the issue. So we intentionally didn't put the data there, but by putting access to all the LinkedIn profiles of the founders, we know it was not that difficult to come up to important conclusions on this. And I'm really happy that this data is being used for that. That now we have data points to back this problem up, which I think, in my way, it's there's two sides of this problem. The number one side is African local founders being not enough represented among the funders who are able to fundraise and successfully scale. And the second bit is the gender balance, with a third bit that is local female founders. That's even more that were even less represented. So I think that's really the triple challenge for the ecosystem in the coming years. And starting with putting data in front of this problem is, I think, an important step.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I totally agree with all of that. And there are definitely three distinct problems, like you said, like the local problem, then it's the gender gap, and then obviously those two combined. But there's really no way for us to collectively take action without the data. So again, much thanks for putting together that data, all the work you guys are doing, and thank you for being here. I think this session was extremely informative. It's always great to hear the story, especially, again, being really into the data myself and now hearing the story behind it. This was definitely really, really awesome, and I'm sure everybody here enjoyed it as well. So before we kind of close out, I would love to just ask anybody here if you have any questions. We'll take like one or two questions just in respect of your time, but one or two questions from anybody in the audience. Definitely feel free to put it in the chat or unmute so we can hear your thoughts on that.
I have a question, Nwanacho, to Maxime. Do you have an idea how this data you're putting out is being used across the continent or globally? Do you have like a mapping of it?
I have that. I have to confess, I didn't really look at the analytics there, but I know the vast majority is in the continent. So that for me is a good news. The other thing I know, on which I have a little bit more data, is the fact that basically entrepreneurs and investors are representing the biggest chunk of users of this data, and that's really good news. I mean, that's really the target for which we're building this. For me, nothing is more rewarding than having a local entrepreneurs in Zambia or Cameroon reaching out and saying, that data is super useful for me to actively fundraise right now, and that's really the kind of stuff I want to hear back. So but to answer your question, in terms of geographical breakdown, I think it's more than half is people in Africa. The rest is a little bit spread, mainly US and Europe.
Great. Any other questions before we close out this session?
Hi, Maxime. My name is Gabriel. I think I was one of the earliest people who signed up to your project, and I've engaged you on LinkedIn as well. And I'd like to apologize because the initial information I started receiving from yourself was regarding historic event that happened And then since I started engaging with you further and just check my email again whilst we were talking, I realized that you were consistent with your information and data. Living in England and trying to engage with the continent, one of the things I sort of find is that there's a cohort of a lot of startups which need assistance in actually developing their ideas to the funding level, but they sort of struggle. And I've had loads of engagement with people. So maybe the question more is leading on from Adiz's question is if you know how people are using the data, or how can a channel be linked to, yes, we've got the names or the details of people who are making it to this level, but how can we pull the rest who are below to that level? Because I think there's a big cohort of people needing assistance in that level, but it's trying to rise up to that level that they're struggling with.
Yeah, tricky question. I mean, the way people are using the data, that one I can answer. I know most entrepreneurs are using it to basically strategically prepare their fundraising. I think that's an important thing. The more the ecosystem progress and becomes sophisticated, it's important that that startups are approaching fundraising in a structured and comprehensive way. And so it's important to know who are the investors who are actively signing checks, in what companies are they focused, what is their investment thesis, which markets are they focusing on, and so on. And basically the database helps you to do that. So that's the first use case I would say that makes a lot of sense, is to know, okay, healthcare in Nigeria, which investors should I approach? Well, first of all, you can look at them by ticket size, how much funding do they usually write checks on, and then you can look at them by sectors, you can look at them by geographies, and then know, okay, those are the top 30 investors that I should start with. So I think that's the first use case. The second use case is obviously on the other side, on investors, using that to create potential deal flow for them. Obviously, there are very large rounds here, and these companies are known now, so that's less helpful for them. But for earlier stage rounds, that's quite helpful. So to know that this startup raised 100K, and if an investor is usually joining rounds at 500K or $1 million, that's useful for them to know, okay, these guys are coming on the radar, and I should probably talk to them. So that's the second use case. To answer your question on, what can we do for companies that are aspiring to sort of join this list, and how this database can be helpful, I think the first one is to help them on the fundraising. I think that's something that has changed a lot now compared to when I started working in the ecosystem, where there was basically no data. So that's an important help. There's a lot more that we can do for companies to fundraise and to scale. That's sort of my other full-time job, if you want, the work I'm doing with Catalyst Fund. And that is, it's acceleration work. It requires a lot of time. There's a lot of accelerator programs in the continent, more than 600 or 700, I think, something like this. The one thing I've learned doing acceleration work with startups over the past couple of years is that at the end of the day, it's just time and effort. So there's no shortcut to that. If you want to support a company, it takes time, and unfortunately, that means you can't support that many companies in parallel. So at the moment, I'm working quite actively with 2 companies of our current cohort with Catalyst Fund, and that's almost a full-time job. And so, yeah, any accelerator that tells you they're working with 20 of them in parallel and they have a team of 2 people, you know that the value they bring to each company is very limited. There's no way around that. It takes time to help them fundraise. It takes time to help them get to product market fit. it takes time to help them recruit and so on. So yeah, that's what I can share at this point. But it's a lot easier today than it was 10 years ago. That's for sure.
Great, great. Are there any more questions before we close this out? Awesome. Yeah, so I think we can close it out. Thank you again for being here. I would recommend everybody, if you haven't, definitely sign up to be receiving these data sets and the updates on Africa the Big Deal, and seeing the startup deals data. I'm definitely signed up and I'm seeing those updates by email, which is awesome. And so everybody sign up and do that. And, you know, we all need to be caught up on the data to really continue to have productive conversations around these issues. So it's an extremely important thing to do. And yeah, I think that's it. Thanks again for being here. And everybody else, be at the summit if you can. It's on Thursday, 8 a.m. Western African time. And we'll be having more great conversations like this, really trying to push forward the African startup ecosystem. So yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.